Welcome everyone to Things Around 8. Dear friends, in this video we will talk about Vladimir Putin's intention to negotiate a ceasefire in Ukraine now in 2024, but with a small detail that is very important for Russia. According to a Reuters report published this Friday, May 24th, Vladimir Putin would be ready to pause his invasion. The report, citing sources close to the Kremlin, states that Putin wants to negotiate a ceasefire in 2024, as long as Ukraine recognizes the current combat lines. In other words, Putin wants to take a break from the war, but without giving up the territories he is currently occupying. Reuters reports that 3 of the 4 sources cited said that Putin is frustrated by the way in which the West, represented by the United States and NATO, is hindering his attempts to end the war in a situation favorable to Russia, which would be the end of fighting through an agreement that guaranteed Russia possession of the territories still occupied. Another of these sources told Reuters that Putin has sufficiently favorable internal conditions to be able to continue fighting for as long as necessary, which seems to indicate that Putin's control over the government is complete, preventing the rise of opposition forces opposed to his war. Also suggesting that on a military level, and above all, in relation to the forces he is willing to launch into war, he would have more than enough means to continue fighting for many years to come. However, this source informed Reuters that despite this, Putin does not want an eternal war in Ukraine. An eternal war, similar to the nearly decade-long conflict that the Soviet Union waged against Afghanistan in the 1980s, is never a good deal for any country, no matter how well prepared and equipped that country is. And we only need to see what happened precisely to the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, with that conflict draining human and material resources, actively contributing to accelerating the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Russia, at the moment, thanks to the large agreements signed mainly with China in the commercial area, which guarantee the sale of large quantities of gas which, even when sold at discounts of more than 40%, create an important financial flow for Putin to maintain his invasion effort, is not at imminent risk of financial collapse. But it is undeniable that the situation is far from ideal, with large and important markets such as Europe completely closed, preventing the full profitability of the large gas pipelines built over the last few years, and which before the war, generated a monthly flow of many billions of dollars into Russian coffers. But if Russia's situation is so comfortable, even launching a new offensive in May against the north of Kharkiv, why is Putin's alleged desire to sign a ceasefire now in 2024? There are several hypotheses, with one of them being Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil and gas infrastructure. For months now, Ukrainians have been dedicated to launching drones against Russian refineries, some of them more than 1,500 kilometers away. With these attacks, forcing Russia to drastically reduce the sale of petroleum products, as was the case with the suspension, for 6 months, of the international sale of Russian gasoline and diesel, to avoid internal supply cuts. The announcement of this suspension confirms that these attacks are really having the intended effect, affecting the only major Russian export product and precisely the one that still guarantees some financial flow for Putin to sustain the war. Therefore, in the view of some analysts, Putin wants a ceasefire now to regularize the operation of his refineries and resume cash flow. Another reason would be the reorganization of the Russian army in Ukraine. After 2 years and 3 months of war and hundreds of thousands of deaths and injuries, the Russian army today is very different from what it was in 2022, with Putin having been forced to hastily create many new units, immediately launching them into combat. Therefore, a ceasefire now would give Putin time to reformulate his army and organize his forces in the occupied territories in Ukraine, which would also allow him to correct any logistical bottlenecks that are delaying the resupply of his forces. As we can see, a ceasefire would be highly beneficial for Russia, setting the stage for new and even more lethal attacks in the future, but it would be disastrous for Ukraine at a strategic level. Right now, as the war stands, Russia still maintains the tactical advantage, thanks to months-long delays in supplying weapons and ammunition to Ukraine. But with the US $60.8 billion package already approved, weapons and ammunition have already flowed back to Ukraine, which means that within a few weeks Ukraine will again be able to block Russian advances in Kharkiv and Donetsk, potentially plunging the war back into stalemate, which is something Putin obviously does not want. Therefore, it is important to emphasize that the advantage is now on Russia's side. But Putin knows this advantage will not last forever. with Ukraine already starting to receive new weapons and ammunition from its allies. And Putin is also feeling the impact of Ukrainian attacks on his refineries in his pocket. And that's why the Kremlin, despite not admitting it publicly, needs a ceasefire now in Ukraine. And I'd like to know your opinion. What do you think of Vladimir Putin's desire to want a ceasefire right now? And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any news.